In the early 17th century, long before the great powers of Europe had drawn firm lines on the map of North America, there existed a land of dense forests, rugged coastlines, and rich estuaries. The French called it Acadia. To the Mi'kmaq who had lived there for millennia, it was their ancestral home. To the ambitious empires of France and England, it was a prize. Acadia was a border colony, a strategic frontier caught between the burgeoning English settlements of New England to the south and the heart of New France in the St. Lawrence Valley to the north. Its value lay not in gold, but in the dense populations of fur-bearing animals in its forests and the teeming schools of cod in its waters, resources that fueled the economies of Europe. This promise of wealth ensured Acadia would be a land of persistent conflict. The first French settlement at Port Royal, established in 1605, was a testament to this instability. It was destroyed by English colonists from Virginia in 1613, its inhabitants scattered. For decades, Acadia was a contested territory, passed between empires, its future uncertain. In Paris, one man sought to bring order to this chaotic frontier: Armand Jean Duplessis, Cardinal Richelieu, the powerful chief minister to King Louis XIII. Richelieu envisioned a unified, powerful, and exclusively Catholic French empire in the New World. To realize this vision, he dissolved the competing, ineffective trading companies and, in 1627, established the Compagnie des Cent Associés, or the Company of 100 Associates. The company's charter was sweeping. It was granted a perpetual monopoly over the lucrative fur trade and seigneurial title to all of North America, from Florida to the Arctic Circle. In return, its mandate was clear: transport 4,000 settlers to New France within 15 years, and ensure they were all French and Catholic. In a move to enforce religious purity, Huguenots, French Protestants, were explicitly forbidden from emigrating, a policy that would have profound consequences for the future of Acadia. Richelieu's plan was not merely for a trading outpost. It was for the creation of a new, devoutly French society in America. The fate of this grand vision would rest in the hands of two men, both named Charles, whose ambitions and characters were as different as the colonial models they represented. Their rivalry would plunge the colony into a nearly 2-decade-long civil war. This conflict was more than a personal feud. It was a clash between two fundamentally different ideas of what Acadia should be. One man envisioned a semi-independent trading frontier, built on local alliances and commercial pragmatism. The other saw a structured agricultural society, a loyal and pious extension of the French crown. The war between them would decide the colony's future. Charles de la Tour was the quintessential Acadian pioneer. Arriving as a teenager in 1610, he chose to stay after the English attack of 1613, immersing himself in the rhythms of the New World. He lived among the Mi'kmaq, married a Mi'kmaq woman, and learned the intricate networks of the fur trade. From his fortified posts, first at Cape Sable and later the formidable Fort La Tour at the mouth of the St. John River, he built a personal commercial empire. His power was homegrown, rooted in his deep knowledge of the land and his strong relationships with its indigenous inhabitants. In 1623, he inherited the leadership of the colony from his predecessor Charles de Biencourt, and in 1631 received a royal commission as lieutenant general for the king in Acadia, giving him a legitimate legal claim to govern. Yet La Tour was a pragmatist. A Huguenot in a Catholic empire, he also accepted a baronetcy of Nova Scotia from the English, a dual allegiance that his rival would later use as a weapon against him. In stark contrast stood Charles de Menou d'Aulnay. A member of the French aristocracy and a devout Catholic, he arrived in 1632 not as an adventurer, but as a naval officer and the trusted lieutenant to his cousin, Governor Isaac de Dazzali. D'Aulnay was an agent of the French court, embodying its ambitions for order and control. His vision for Acadia was not a sprawling fur trading network, but a stable, permanent colony of French families, rooted in agriculture and unwavering in their Catholic faith. He was a colonizer, not a trader, and saw himself as the true instrument of Cardinal Richelieu's grand design. As long as the respected Governor Dazzali lived, a fragile balance was maintained. But in 1635, Dazzali died suddenly, leaving a dangerous power vacuum. His brother, Claude, inherited the title of governor, but chose to remain in France, appointing Daulnay as his lieutenant to govern in his stead. This act set the stage for war. In one small, remote colony, there were now two men, each with a legitimate claim to authority. The French crown, thousands of miles away and with a poor understanding of Acadian geography, compounded the error by issuing a series of vague and overlapping commissions and land grants to both men. This administrative negligence transformed a rivalry of personalities and colonial philosophies into a legally sanctioned conflict. The Crown had failed to establish a clear line of command, effectively creating a state of sanctioned anarchy. The Acadian Civil War was about to begin. The war for Acadia did not begin on the battlefield, but in the corridors of power in Paris. Charles Daulnay, with his aristocratic connections and impeccable Catholic credentials, proved a master of court politics. He traveled to France and skillfully painted his rival, Latour, as a rebellious Protestant with dangerous loyalties to the English. The French court, naturally favoring the man who best represented its own vision for the colonies, sided with Daulnay. A series of royal orders steadily strengthened Daulnay's legal position, culminating in a 1641 warrant for Latour's arrest on charges of treason. Latour, entrenched in his fort on the St. John River, refused to submit. In the eyes of his king, he was now an outlaw. Legal maneuvering reaching its limit, the conflict turned violent. In 1640, Latour launched a naval attack on Daulnay's capital at Port Royal. The assault failed, and Latour and his men were forced to surrender. Though a minor engagement, the Battle of Port Royal was a point of no return. Blood had been spilled, and the feud was now an open war. Blockaded by Daulnay's ships and branded a traitor by France, Latour made a desperate and audacious move. In 1643, he sailed south to the Massachusetts Bay Colony, seeking aid from his Protestant neighbors in Boston. His arrival threw the Puritan leadership into a profound debate, testing the very principles upon which they had founded their city upon a hill. Governor John Winthrop faced a difficult choice. On one side were the colony's merchants, who saw a golden opportunity to break Daulnay's monopoly and open up the rich Acadian trade routes. They, along with some religious leaders, also argued for supporting a fellow Protestant against a papist agent of Catholic France. On the other side were more cautious magistrates and elders. They warned against meddling in the internal affairs of the French king and questioned the wisdom of allying with Latour, a man of ambiguous loyalty. This intervention in a French internal dispute effectively transformed the Acadian feud into a proxy conflict for the larger religious and imperial rivalries shaping North America. Ultimately, Winthrop chose a middle path. While the government of Massachusetts would not officially intervene, it granted Latour permission to hire private ships and recruit mercenaries from the Boston populace. It was a controversial decision, one that divided the colony, but it gave Latour the military strength he needed to break Daulnay's blockade and continue his fight. While Latour negotiated in Boston, his cause was being championed in France by his remarkable wife, Françoise Marie Jacquelin. More than just a governor's spouse, she was a formidable political operator in her own right. In 1642, she had slipped through Daulnay's blockade of the St. John River, sailed to France, and personally pleaded her husband's case before the court. She was so persuasive that she not only had the treason charges against Latour overturned, but also secured a warship, the St. Clement, laden with supplies to reinforce his fort. This diplomatic triumph was not merely an act of a supportive wife. It was a decisive strategic victory. Without her intervention, D'Aulnay's legal maneuvering might have ended the war in 1641. Françoise-Marie Jacquelin's courage and political acumen ensured the conflict would continue, setting the stage for its dramatic and tragic climax. In the spring of 1645, Charles de La Tour once again sailed for Boston, seeking to raise more funds and supplies for his protracted war. He left the defense of his stronghold, Fort La Tour, and its garrison of roughly 45 soldiers in the capable hands of his wife, Françoise Marie. D'Aulnay, ever watchful, learned of his rival's absence. Seeing a chance to strike a final decisive blow, he gathered a force of 200 men and sailed across the Bay of Fundy. On April 13th, Easter Sunday, his warship appeared before Fort La Tour. D'Aulnay demanded surrender. The response from within the fort was a volley of cannon fire. For 4 days, the battle raged. From the fort's ramparts, Madame de La Tour commanded the defense, directing her small garrison with such skill and ferocity that they repelled D'Aulnay's initial assaults. The defenders raised the red flag of defiance, signaling their intent to fight to the death. For her extraordinary bravery, she would become known to history as the Lioness of La Tour. But courage could not hold out forever against overwhelming numbers. D'Aulnay's relentless bombardment eventually breached the fort's walls. With her defenses crumbling and her forces dwindling, Françoise-Marie Jacquelin saw that further resistance was futile. She agreed to surrender, but only after extracting a solemn promise from D'Aulnay that he would grant quarter to all, sparing the lives of her surviving soldiers. D'Aulnay agreed. It was a lie. Once his men had secured the fort, D'Aulnay broke his word. In an act of shocking brutality, he ordered the entire garrison to be hanged. To compound the horror, he forced Madame de La Tour to watch the executions with a hangman's noose around her own neck. 3 weeks later, still a prisoner in her own captured fort, Françoise-Marie Jacquelin died. The cause of her death remains unknown, but the people of Acadia whispered that she died of grief and rage. With his wife dead, his fort in ruins, and his men executed, Charles de La Tour was utterly defeated. He fled to Quebec, a refugee, while D'Aulnay stood as the undisputed master of Acadia. D'Aulnay had won his war, but his victory was built on an act of treachery. While it brought him the absolute control he craved, the massacre at Fort La Tour established a legacy of violence and bad faith that would poison Acadian politics and undermine the very stability he claimed to be building. For 5 years, Charles d'Aulnay ruled Acadia as a king. In 1647, his authority was officially confirmed by the French crown, which named him governor over the entire territory. He threw himself into his colonial project, bringing over new families from France, building mills, and reclaiming fertile farmland from the sea with an ambitious system of dikes and tide gates. His vision of a permanent agricultural Acadia was taking shape. But in May of 1650, his reign came to a sudden and bizarre end. While crossing the Annapolis Basin, his canoe capsized. He was pulled from the frigid water, but died from exposure, leaving the colony he had fought so ruthlessly to control without a leader. D'Aulnay's death plunged Acadia back into chaos. His wife, Jeanne Motin, was left with 8 young children and a staggering financial crisis. D'Aulnay's long war against La Tour and his expensive colonial projects had been financed by massive loans. The estate was now saddled with a debt of over 300,000 livres. D'Aulnay's chief creditor, Emmanuel Laborgne, descended upon Port Royal, seizing assets and looting property to satisfy the debt. The colony D'Aulnay had built was on the brink of being repossessed. News of D'Aulnay's death reached Charles de La Tour in his Quebec exile. Seizing the opportunity, he sailed to France, where he successfully argued his case at court. In 1651, he received a royal pardon and was reappointed governor of Acadia. Upon his return, he found his old enemy's estate in ruins and his widow besieged by creditors. What happened next was one of the most remarkable turns in colonial history. On February 24, 1653, Charles de la Tour married Jeanne Motin, the widow of the man who had destroyed his fort and killed his first wife. This was no love match. It was a brilliant act of political and economic pragmatism. The contract explicitly stated its purpose was to bring peace and tranquility of the country and concord and union between the two families. By marrying, La Tour and Motin merged the two warring factions, consolidated their land claims, and formed a united front against the creditors who threatened to devour what was left of Acadia. It was the final desperate attempt by Acadian leaders to forge a stable future for themselves. This newfound peace would not last. The long civil war had left Acadia politically fractured and financially exhausted. It was a ripe target. In 1654, England, as part of its larger conflict with the Dutch, dispatched an expedition from Boston to seize rival colonial outposts. The fleet, commanded by Major Robert Sedgwick, sailed into Acadian waters. The weakened French colony could offer little resistance. Sedgwick quickly captured La Tour's fort on the St. John River and then Daunay's former capital at Port Royal. In a matter of weeks, the entire colony fell. The Acadian Civil War was over not because one side had won, but because an outside power had conquered them both. The nearly 20-year struggle between two Frenchmen for control of Acadia had only one true victor: England. The war stands as a stark example of a flawed colonial strategy. France's reliance on rival governors and private financing, rather than unified state support, created the very instability that allowed its English rivals to seize the prize. Charles de la Tour, the ultimate survivor, negotiated with his new English masters, sold his land rights, and retired to live out his days in Acadia. The kingdom they and Daunay had fought over was no longer theirs, a prelude to the final fall of French Acadia a century later.